Hey everyone, before we get this video started, I just wanted to let you all know that I am now on a website called Coffee, or Ko-fi, but it's coffee, because the whole premise of it is you can just toss somebody a few bucks to buy a coffee. You guys have asked in the past how you can support the channel. This is now a way. I thought it was a nice opt-in way where you just toss a few bucks whenever you feel like, and it goes to me, and it's kind of just like a light thing instead of having to pay for a subscription model or anticipate goods down the line. I'll just always be doing these videos, and if you ever feel like throwing some monetary appreciation my way, you can do it via this website. Coffee.com/Zatransis. Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Olive. So I did this drawing back in 2013. It was just some random ballpoint pen sketch when I was messing around, but every now and then I come across it in my phone and I feel like I should do something more with it. So that's what I decided to do here. So here's the final image, and now let's go into the process. First, I brought the image into my canvas. My canvas is already set to what I always do things at, which is listed down below in the description. Then I just set it to multiply, lowered its, I desaturated it, set it to multiply, and then lowered its opacity so that I could start working on the flats. You can see that when I started this, I had more of a yellowy, almost like papery color background. Over time, that of course changed. The flats are split up into a number of groupings in order for me to have the best control possible. So you can see that a majority of her body, since this is all the paint marks you see right now are on the same layer, these were all done together. So we've got her neck coming down into her torso, down into her back section, and onto her leg. That's all going to be one piece. Then on top of that, I'm going to have a layer that is her face skin, a separate layer that is her arm, the one that's like straight in front of us, and then a layer that is the arm all the way in the distance. Of course, then I'll also have layers for the hair and the facial features and things like that. But that's how the body's broken up so that I can have control. Of course, the only sort of area of concern there is the arm attaches to the torso and there's no break there. So I just have to make sure that that is smooth and that my layers aren't screwing that up in any way. Here you can see I turned the body layers off, and now I'm painting in the arm. All I did was turn that off so that I could see really clearly what I was doing. Now, if you're new to this channel, the brush that I'm using here is standard in Procreate. It's called the turpentine brush, and I always forget, but it's either in the artistic section or the painting section. I've moved it out of there and put it into just a section I created that is my own brushes, or not my own brushes, the brushes I use the most. So I very rarely dip in there and find it in that section. Since this original sketch is just that, it's a sketch, the only thing that I had to figure out and like flesh out further was the environment, since she's not really like sitting on anything. And so I decided to treat it like an artistic photo shoot of some sort. So she's literally just sitting on a cube that is the same color as the environment around her, instead of trying to tell like a further story by putting her in like a chair with some clothes draped over it and something in the background and a window. I just kept it all pretty simplistic because that's all I care about. I just care about the character. I didn't really care about the environment for this. That said, I've been considering doing more things like that, just as kind of like a knockaround thing, and I'm coming up on a pretty big vacation for the holiday season, so I was thinking about tackling some bigger pieces during that time instead of banging these out like 2 a week or 1 a week or whatever I'm currently doing. So here you can see I start by throwing in this gray cube, but the background is also still yellow, and if you saw the final version of this, everything is in red. So we end up changing that later. We also end up adjusting the perspective on that box quite a bit as time goes on. Here I was just blocking it in so that I knew where that was going to be. Now we're doing her hair. You can see by the way that her like face skin is underneath that hair. In this piece, the hair is on top of the head. Occasionally, I will cut out the hair shape on the skin, and then I'll put the hair behind it. But for this one, it just made sense. Since a majority of that hair goes over her like forehead, that's fine. I think I spoke in the last video about there being a logic to the way the layers are set up so that it just doesn't get really confusing for you when you're in the middle of doing the work. So for instance, if I put the hair on top of the forehead in the layer stack, because that is the way her hair is in the real world, that makes it easier for me as an artist to just kind of parse what layers are where. If I had cut out the skin and put that hair behind it, maybe that would have been a way I could have done it, but it would have added complication to the way I perceive it. And I've talked on this channel before that so much about doing art is about kind of like gaming your own brain. Like, my brain has these limitations, or I have these habits that I do all the time, and you're always trying to kind of work around those and either use them in like a positive way or just completely circumvent them. And so here we've got the black part of her hair is on top, and then underneath that is the dyed like magenta part, and then there's another layer now that is behind her head layer that is also magenta but slightly darkened. So now we're moving on to her eyebrows, which are on a separate layer. I often separate the hair and the eyebrow layer just so that I can do whatever I want with them later. Either I want to change the color of one or the other, or I want to change the position in some way. But for this one, it really didn't matter other than just I kept them separate and then ended up not doing anything particularly special with them later on. Now we'll move on to flattening the eyes. The eyes are going to get a few layers here. They're going to get the sort of main whites of the eyes, the eyelashes, the iris, and then a glint at the end. The glint is not necessarily going to be the final position. I just kind of like throwing it in as my point of reference for the kind of like the highest value thing in the image, and it just kind of helps me see the piece come together. That's another thing that I've talked about in the past, which ties into what I was just saying about gaming your brain, is sometimes when you're in the middle of these pieces and you don't know they're going to come together, it's good to give yourself like little wins to kind of remind yourself like, oh yeah, I do know how to paint and I do know how to finish a piece. And so something like that can give you that little glimpse into, oh, this is going to eventually come together. That's great. I'm not a complete failure, which is a half joke, but we all know that there are days. In fact, I was just talking to an artist friend of mine who I won't name to protect his identity, but he was just saying the other day, like, I've sat there for 2 hours trying to draw and I couldn't remember how to draw. And this guy's a professional artist. He's been working in art professionally for like 20 years, and it's just that thing. That's just what happens sometimes with your brain. So I think giving yourself that little bit of encouragement in a tangible way is a really good idea. Easiest color to throw in for lips is just like a red. I usually use almost pink and then set it to multiply and lower its opacity a little bit, because no matter whom I'm painting, I like to have the color pick up some of the natural skin underneath. So it's like a way for my brain to pick a more measured color than just putting in something that feels color selected. It's like I'm using a little bit of a color that's then being influenced by the skin, and it's harmonizing it a little bit more. Here you can see I'm throwing in her earring. I just had to do a little bit of cleanup there because it's a plug and it has a hole in it. So I wanted to get that right. I added a little bit of having her hair come down, and you can see she's got like black, almost like hematite jewelry across everything. I just thought that'd be a fun vibe. I don't know what's happening here. I watched the footage and I was like, what was I even thinking? So I don't know what all that color testing was there. Now here I'm changing the color to red, you could see, which means I have to now adjust this box and get it set up. But that's actually kind of the least important thing to talk about here. We'll come back to the color choice later. Let's take a minute here and talk about multiply layers, since we're about to get into the shadow portion of this piece. Okay, so I talk a lot about multiply layers and I give brief descriptions, but I want to just quickly take a second and actually just show you a little bit more clearly. I think I've done this in the past, long time ago, but I thought it'd be good for a refresher right now. The reason why I use multiply as a shadow layer is because multiply darkens, but it also retains the color in some quantity. So let's demonstrate that basically. So if I take a blue, let's just make that blue, and I'll even use the turpentine brush so that we can see exactly the way this works. Actually, I probably shouldn't use the turpentine brush just because it is a little on the messy side and it might not sell the idea, but I think you'll get it regardless. So we've got white and then a blue ballish smudge thing. If I go to a new layer, and let's not change my color at all, let's just draw a streak across here like that, and then you can see here that that layer is set to normal. That's what that little N means next to the checkbox. I'm going to now convert that to multiply, and you can see right there it gets darker where it overlays. If I were to change that color, which I can do by just coming over here, you can see how it influences that blue underneath. Depending on the color, it will influence the color underneath in lots of different ways. Now, the thing about multiply, the reason why we use it for shadows is because multiply darkens, and they tell you that in Procreate by having it be in the darken category. You can see down here where I'm tapping, it is dark there. Or I mean, it says darken there. It is dark there. It says darken. Over here is lighten, and there's lightening things here. Now, each one of these blend modes it handles that principle differently. So darken, you can see here if I turn to linear burn, it gets crazy dark. If I turn it to color burn, you can see that the color doesn't even carry outside of the blue ball. If I go to just darken, you can see things darken all around, but look at how that sort of yellowy orangey plays with the blue versus multiply. Let me turn to multiply. Boink. And then lastly, there's darker color. Now, I can't explain to you all of the principles of all of these different blend modes. I can tell you that I will monkey around with them every now and then and try to discover what happens when I set it to different things, but what I can tell you about is multiply. The way multiply essentially works is black, which I will paint right there, is opaque, and white is transparent. Now, if I set this to normal, you'll see that I have white, black, and then this weird rusty whatever color. If I turn that back to multiply, the white will disappear. So that means you understand that it's on a gradient from white to black is transparent to fully opaque. Now, we can use that principle when we're doing our shadows. So let's take one of these colors down here that I randomly pick sometimes to use a shadow. You can see where it lands on the color scale, this square here. You can see in the top right it gets more saturated, in the bottom right it's saturated but dark, top left completely desaturated and completely light, bottom left completely desaturated and completely dark. So if we are over here in this range and we set our layer to multiply, even though this color is quite light, when it interacts with another color, it gets quite dark. And you can see how when I overlay off of the blue onto the white, you can see the color there because it's multiplying white, so that means it's basically multiplying nothing. It's just the raw color. If you set this to normal, that color doesn't change. The part where it's white, multiply. Let me get this over so you can see that again. Normal, multiply. So the way that you can think about that then is that multiply will darken, but it will retain qualities of the color that you are using when it overlaps with another color. So if we take this right now also and saturate it, you can see how it changes on the blue. If I desaturate it, you can see what it does. If I take it all the way to black, it's just going to go all the way to black. If I take it all the way to white, it's going to completely disappear. This is also why when we have an image, let's make up an image real quick. Let's take black and just put a squiggle, and let's fill this with white and merge them. This is a simulation of having a piece of line art, right? It's all together, and there's nothing you can do with it because you can't see through it. This is why the standard tip is converted to multiply. If I turn on all these layers that I had back here before, and now I switch this to multiply, suddenly it's as if the white is gone. Obviously the white's not gone, but we know that multiply, when it gets closer to white, it becomes more transparent. And so that's why the simple trick for a line art layer is to just set it to multiply, and then you can adjust its opacity all you want. If we were in Photoshop, I would show you a different trick to clean up line art, but we're not. So I'll save that for another time. But this is the straightforward, simplistic way. It's the exact same way with this piece that I brought in the line art and started messing with it. So here we have the line art. This is the photo. You can tell it's from the old days of Instagram. And you can also see I did not resize it to completely fit the canvas because that's not the point here. If we just, for testing purposes, put a color behind here. Let's get a bigger, fatter color, like that. If we set this layer just to multiply by itself, you can see now that aspects of it that go towards white become transparent, and aspects of it that go towards black become opaque. Here it is black, so it is opaque, and here it is lighter, so it is see-through. And even the little noise that you see there, each one of those little darker dots starts becoming more and more opaque depending on the dot. So how do we clean this up for the image? We just take this and desaturate it. So we go into our hue, saturation, brightness, and take saturation all the way down. And then let's just say you want it a little bit more clean. You could go into curves and you could just get it a little bit more. Oops, I'm set to just red. There we go. You can do something like this to get it to pop a little bit more if you want a more extreme representation, and then you can adjust your opacity and you can paint from there. So that is a brief explanation of multiply, one of the many blend modes that you have in your layers in Procreate. So now that we understand multiply better, we understand how these shadows are working. I'm using a light, pale, reddish, tannish brown kind of thing, and it's set to multiply. And you, oh, by the way, I have her arm lowered in opacity just so I can see it against the other parts of her body. That's why that looked really red for a second. So that color is what I'm using that's set to multiply for my ambient occlusion pass here. This is where, that's how the color is reacting, I should say. That's the thing I want to point out, is that the color that is of her skin and then the shadow layer that I'm using, because even though it's very light and pale, when it gets multiplied, it ends up giving you that darker value for basically anything that you're laying it on. If I were to use that color on the red in the background or in her eyes, which I will eventually do, it's always going to bring that color darker as long as I am not basically all the way up in white for my color. So now we have her back arm turned off, we have her front arm turned off, and then we have her body layer lowered in opacity so that I can just see absolutely everything that I'm doing. Now, her body got lowered in opacity first because I had the arm on. There we go, we just turned it back on again. And this is just so I can see all the separations. When you've got all these different layers like what I tend to use, and they're all overlapping each other and they're all the same base flat, you have to start doing little tricks so that you can tell them apart. Otherwise you're kind of flying blind. So her body flat is lowered in opacity. Now I do the body flat because it is the one that I'm painting on, and if I lowered the arm opacity, we still wouldn't see where everything overlaps, because if you have a color that is overlapping with itself and the total opacity adds up to 100%, it's just going to be 100%. You're not going to be able to tell the separation. But if we have the body lowered and then the top arm and the face and whatever at 100%, we won't have an overlap situation, and we can very clearly see where everything stops and starts. I feel like that explanation was insanely complicated, and I could have said that more simply, so sorry for that if it made no sense to you. But just, I guess the simpler way to say that is go ahead when you're painting and adjust your opacities of your flats when you need to see clarity, and you'll see sort of which ones work better for you to be on or off, basically. Now, because of the way these layers are set up, we go from the back arm to the body and then to the hair that is hanging down behind her face. That is the next layer up in the stack. Then from there, I'm pretty sure, we'll see in a second, it goes to face and all the facial features and stuff, but then we'll eventually get to that arm, because that arm I think is the topmost thing on the stack. And I'm wrong. Here we are working on the arm. Now, you'll notice from the original sketch, I thickened her arm a little bit. Again, it was a really quick sketch. It needed more support there, and probably a few more anatomical adjustments across the board. But sometimes when you've got a sketch and things aren't necessarily perfect, but there's an energy to it that you like, you just kind of ride that out and you ignore little problems that there could be, I guess, throughout there. So here we're just trying to emphasize the anatomy of her arm, reconciling the stylization with what it would be in the real world. And in the original line art, her hand wasn't fleshed out really at all. So here it wasn't either. I just kind of blocked it in, and now we're going in with the shadow layer and just on a new layer sketching in the hand real quick, and then figuring out what that structure should be in a better way, like in a more shadow-based, lighting-based way. One thing that you'll notice too is that her fingernails are not yet in, as her jewelry is not also. Well, that is a terrible sentence. Her jewelry is not in there either on her hand. So we have to come back to that later. But the nice thing is that if we add those layers on top, something I've referenced in previous videos, as long as those flat layers go on top, they're easy to then clear from the shadow layer and add on. If they have to go somewhere in between, it gets a lot trickier. So in a minute, we're going to move on from the arm back into the face. Here we go. We've got that sort of soft shadow coming off of her hair, and now we're moving into the face. Now, something that I want to point out is every now and then you see the layers return back to normal, and I've talked about this before. What you're trying to avoid there is the way Procreate handles two overlapping multiply layers, is it will figure out the new color that makes that multiply as dark as it is when you merge them together. And if you want them all to be the same color across the board, affecting everything the same, you have to convert it all back to normal before you merge them. So I have layers here where I might break off and do a new layer, just because I want to make sure I don't do something destructive to a previous layer, to the previous efforts in the current shadow layer. So instead I'll make a new one, work the shadows there, convert everything to normal, and then merge them together again and set it back to multiply. We're going to do the shadows for the face here, the lips, which are their own layer, but sometimes I treat them as such, sometimes I don't, and then the jewelry. But before we do the jewelry, you'll see that I'll jump down and I'll add it to the hand before we come back and do the rest of it, because all the jewelry is all on its own layer, because in this scenario we just don't have anything that overlaps. Right there you saw everything flip to normal. That was me merging all those shadow layers back together again, and then moving on to the eyes. this point I realized that I want to get some shadows of her casting onto the box she's on, some ambient occlusion ones, so I have to kind of add those in later, which is fine as their own layer. Paint them in, clear them, set them up, no problem, because then we're going to move on to the direct light layer. Now the direct light is going to be coming from the top right sort of towards us, like on our side of the whole thing, and cast shadow across basically her back. So everything on her front is going to be in shadow, and she's going to be casting shadow that way. One thing I also want to bring up here, when you've got a nude figure from head to toe, trying to find opportunities to really sell skin, I've talked about this before, is important. Skin varies across the human body, not only in texture, but also in color. And so you always want to try and sell the life of the character that you're doing, and that's, I think, why you see skin get pushed a lot, you see eyes get pushed a lot, because those are the things that we associate with things like connection, whether it's a visual connection or a physical connection, and we see our own skin all the time, and we look at it and we perceive these variations even though we may not be totally conscious of them. So in the case of this character, you see me putting in things like essentially tan lines, although soft because it's not like she was at the beach all day kind of thing. So you see tan lines, you see darkening in certain areas. Depending on the ethnicity of the character, you might see blood showing through the skin more or less, veins showing through skin more or less, darkening around the eyes. There's like a whole litany of things. So the point is especially when you've got a character who is showing so much of their bare body, like in this image, you want to try and sell those things as much as possible. So similarly to how I've referenced in previous pieces, I don't bring in those variations on the face until I've got the structure done. The same thing is true with this character. We're going to wait for all of the lighting to get done. Well, maybe not all of the lighting. I can't remember if we do all of it, but I almost always wait for the shadows, because then I at least know the landmarks of the body and the face, and then we're going to go in and we're going to put as much variation as we can. Sometimes you push it a little more than what is realistic because you're trying to sell, right? So when you look at this image right now, we've got all these shadows in. We've got the soft ambient occlusion shadows. We've got this direct cast shadow. But she still feels like she's missing some degree of life, I guess. And we're going to get that in that skin variation. We're also going to get that when we start putting in the highlight layer. I shouldn't call it a highlight layer because it's not like the highlights like in her eyes, but more of just a lighten layer so that we can try and sell even more dimension. Depending on the piece, I will do what I'm about to do now, which is this layer that I just referred to as almost like a rounding layer. It's a layer where I'm trying to capture more of the form turning by having the edges become shadowed. Again, this is where I show how poorly trained I guess I am. I'm sure there's an actual technical term for this, but you can see that shadowing happening around the arm, and then we'll also put it like around the leg and around other parts, and that is to try and sell the dimension of her form. And so I just usually refer to it as like a rounding shadow or a rounding layer because it helps me round off the dimension of the character. So that means that now what we're talking about in this file is all the flats and then 3 shadow layers right now. A ambient occlusion or form shadow, depending on whether or not you want to use real words or words I'm making up, a direct light shadow or a cast shadow or whatever, and then a rounding shadow layer, and that's what's here. You can see that going around her butt and going around her like back and rounding all of that off. It's just to try and really sell that dimension. It doesn't really matter because they're all multiply layers where this layer goes in the stack, but it is under the cast shadow. It's like AO, then this, and then the cast shadow. But again, like I said, it really doesn't matter because when you're dealing with multiplies, they're all adding on top. They're all multiplying on top of each other until they hit black. So like if you duplicated those layers like 10 times, they would eventually hit black. And that's, but obviously we don't want that. We don't want that dark a shadow. But so because they're all additive like that, it doesn't matter that they, what order they are in that stack. Here's where we'll also put in some extra supporting shadows, like the shadow under her nose, and then eventually, I don't remember if it's sooner or later, we'll put the shadow on her upper lip. I've mentioned that in the past, that I like driving the dimension of the mouth just by always putting that in shadow. Eventually there'll be bounce lights, or not bounce lights, sorry, there'll be bounce happening from different surfaces to other surfaces, and that will lighten some of those a little bit, but that being there is important. You can see here we're rounding off that arm, since that arm definitely falls off towards the front side of her body because of where the lighting is. Again, this is like it's almost like a patch layer where we're coming in and we're saying, okay, something's not exactly working here, and it's the form, so we're putting in some extra shadow because we're identifying that she's flattening out, and we need to add some of that extra rounding, and that's where that comes from. This will all get slightly adjusted as we go. It gets thrown in a little bit crudely immediately so that I can see if I'm on the right track. That's why you saw it flipping on and off right there. It's me being like, is this right? Is this working? Because sometimes you go in and you're just trying to fix it, and other times you know exactly what you're doing. I think that's also something that these time lapses have always kind of ruined in a way, is that not all artists go in and do exactly what they... Oh, here we go. Here's the skin variation. Sorry, I hate to change topics, but here's skin variation. For this tan line part, it's just a white that I'm then lowering the opacity on. I maybe even set it to like a overlay and lower the opacity. We've got other amounts of lightening and darkening happening across there. We've got a little bit of darkening on the elbow. You can see, by the way, that what those little blotches of blue was me just testing out what color I was going to use for my highlight there to make sure it was looking good. So anyways, I think that time lapses have sometimes ruined it. I mean, they show the whole process, but I think that it kind of still makes people think that artists sit down and they just bang out exactly what they want and it's super linear. And that is true sometimes, for sure, especially if an artist isn't taking risks or doing things that they're not used to or whatever. But there's also a lot of, oh shit, that doesn't look right, or oh, okay, let me do this, or okay, if I do this, is that going to save this? Like, there's a lot of that kind of thought process that also goes on. And that's what that sort of rounding layer kind of did. So where we're at now, we've put in some skin variation. I sort of tried to use logic, and of course reference, always look up reference. I tried to use also some logic though to say, okay, well, she wears clothes most of the time. She almost always will be wearing like underwear or a bikini or something like that. So what I did was I applied some lightening to like her torso overall and a little bit on her legs, and then more lightening around where her underwear or a bikini would be, so that we are trying to establish sort of like exposure, like when is she in the sun? Can I get skin variation off of that? Going back to what I said before, we're trying to sell skin, we're trying to sell the life of the character. By life I mean like that they are alive, not their background. And we're trying to oversell that. So we're trying to find opportunities to go in and say like, okay, let's really sell the skin. The eyes are being oversold as well because we're trying to get connection with the character. And now we are doing lighting on the eyes. So we're using this blue that is reduced in opacity, but it is not set to any blend modes, and we're using that as light, which means on the skin it's giving us a brightening effect, and on the eyes it's giving us a reflection effect. And now we're using that same layer to put the shine into the hair. This would be the sort of fatter shine, and then we're going to do a skinnier shine, and that's to stylistically have like a fall off, like a hot part of the shine and then a diminished part of the shine. Went a little crazy with the short part of her hair, so it kind of starts feeling like scale mail, and we don't want that at all. We just want it to look like it's kind of short and a little bit on the shaggy side. So we'll knock down some of the shine there. We're actually knocking down the shine a little bit across the board. You can see it was too much was put in. I also have that little cut in her eyebrow. We just quickly add like a little bit of a scar. You'll see it pop in where I painted in a little bit light in color, and then set it to overlay, lower its opacity, and then we've got just a little bit of an implication of that scar. Some lightening in the central part of the face, and then we put some of that lightening in other areas as well. And now we go into some box fixing. You can see that the box doesn't go all the way down because I adjusted it, and then I'm like, that perspective is whack, so I flatten it out a little bit and try to adjust all of that, and then we eventually get to a place where that box is now like fixed and no longer a complete eyesore anymore. Well, not like now, but again, you can see I tackled this box like 100 times, and that's because it wasn't planned. There was no planning to make that like in perspective or make that good. It was just in that original sketch, and it was just shittily implied, and now it's like, okay, well, let's do it for real. And that's always the thing when you like just sort of throw in like a little rough thing, and then later you want to paint it and make it more tangible, and you're like, ugh, now I have to figure it all out. So we're gonna go and get the shadows put in there so that that box is just sold properly. And I want to also point out, because we're going to jump up here a second, I bring her rib cage forward just a little bit right there, because she was slender and stylized, but I felt like there needed to be a little bit more support, so that got popped in there. And that also got put in just as a paint over. There's no proper shadowing happening with that. And now we're doing the eyes, getting a better shine in there, like a reflection, getting a hot spot in that reflection put in, which we're then going to duplicate and blur as a blue underneath it, so that the color is being maintained of our lighting, that hot light is a blue light. And then we've got a little bit of sort of like wetness implied in the lower lid of the eye. You can see that there, and also in that little sort of eye meat corner, which I always forget the name of. And I want to pop out for a second here so you can quickly see a bunch of color adjustments that are just about making some color calls. You can see now her lips are olive, which is where the name of the piece came from. Haha, tricked you, didn't I? And we're just doing a bunch of other little tweaks. You can see a bunch of just flickering happening because we're getting close to the end of this, and when we get close to the end, that's when all these type of little like turn them on, turn them off, make this adjustment, make that adjustment starts happening. Now that a bunch of minor adjustments have been put in, and we've got a vertical painted texture happening for the background, which is just hand painted, it's not a texture, it's just vertical paints, we can start talking about something that is actually happening, which is this outline. I thought it'd be cool, and I do think it's cool in some ways, to do this really thin, just kind of implied different color for the outline. I think it works for some pieces. I just think that for this one, it ultimately was like weird and distracting. I was very happy with the way her form came out in this. So once I started putting that on it, I was like, this is actually really distracting, and I don't want that there. So instead what I did was I switched it to this black with a lowered opacity, just to give a sort of stylized haloing, like a black haloing happening around her. And then we start going into, okay, well, let's Instead of the background being an ethereal graphic element, let's make it a physical wall, which means then cast shadow time. So we take her and we duplicate her and make her all black, put it in the background layer and lower its opacity. We warp it so that it's like you see right now, and that gives us a great impression of what a cast shadow could end up looking like. But then in order to make it better and just make it look a little bit more realistic, we go in and we paint it and we make it look more painterly instead of just like a direct copy. I also put a dark gradient on it so that it looks as if it's falling off as it's getting further away, because the bounce light is sort of infecting it, I guess you could say. Now I'm flipping layers on and off again, making sure I've got everything the way that I want it to be. And now like a bunch of really minor things are happening that's actually kind of hard to pick out. Like you can see there by her neck, we've got the hot rim going in for the subsurface scattering on the edge of the shadow, and it's going on all over. And then we're going to put a little bit of a stylistic paint around the shadow that's being cast on the wall. You can see in a minute we're going to make that shadow back there messier and a little bit more hand painted, and then we'll also put that edging around it. So there's the edging. We're going to mess with that shadow a little bit more, but then that version is more or less what we're going to end up sticking with. Which is kind of funny because you go through all these little things, you're exploring all these things. Oh, what if I do this? What if I do that? And then you kind of pull back and say, actually, let's keep it a little bit more simple, because then we can just enjoy the shapes and the way it's rendered without being distracted by, oh, and then there's a crazy rim light or whatever the thing is. Sometimes as an artist, you always want to do more, and then you realize you should do less. And this right here is the final image. Let's take a quick look at the piece that I did 6 years ago, the rough sketch. So this was the rough, positioned how it is in the illustration. And then with these recent efforts, we took it to this, which I am quite happy with the outcome. I hope you enjoy seeing the final version and all the process, and I hope you enjoyed the multiply blend mode breakdown. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed watching this, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell. And I hope I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.